Hi Alessandro, and let's break down your animations. So we've got quite a lot of nice animations here. So let's start with these ones. So I like the overall motion of all of these animations. I like the timing and they're very creative. So that's great. Let's see where we can improve. So for the most part, there aren't major changes that I would suggest here in these ones. So it's just minor stuff. So for the first one, the scenes that we can work on a bit is refining the form and spacing. So getting rid of sudden shapes here. You see it appears, suddenly disappears. Getting more careful with the form here. You see you get an acceleration, deceleration, acceleration. I would smooth out the form here and here. Then, since we were making soft rounded shapes, I would continue to round the shape here so that it matches the overall quality of other frames. I would also smooth this edge. Since it's going forward, it should have forward momentum, so I would move this particle a bit further so it doesn't stop in one spot. And the same thing with this particle. I would move it slightly forward to retain that momentum. Right now we're kinda losing the momentum. To make it more interesting, you see you've got a very predictable progression of particles. They go from big to small, very repetitively. So it's like they're on a scale. So instead of doing it like this, we can give it a bit more variation in terms of the size of the particle and the form, if you want. So add in some bits, smaller bits, add in some bigger bits, and giving it some variety. The same thing here, for example. They cut right in the middle and we get two absolutely similar particles, and the same thing happens here. So again, to spice it up, to make it more interesting, we can use variety to our advantage and make forms different. Then again, we can polish the forms a bit. You see, kinda goes like this, then increases. So what would be a good way to make this form more appealing? We can emphasize this curve more, get rid of that sharp transition, smoothen it out a bit. If you want, you can do it like this, or as a smooth surface, or we can break it down into two parts. And then do this and make this slightly asymmetrical. So what we're aiming for is to get a clear, nice shape and form. So you see, getting rid of that angle, emphasizing the form and the rotation, helps us get a very nice, clean, interesting shape. Again, getting rid of some of that repetition would help get more interesting design between particles, so they wouldn't repeat as much. Right now, if you look here, we've got, again, fairly predictable progression of size, and they're quite similar. So the same thing happens here essentially. You divide most particles right in the middle, and that creates a lot of repetition. And again, we want to retain some of that forward momentum so we can push the particle a bit forward. And for smaller particles, it's important to pay attention to where they're going. So it's going here, and then it's suddenly going to this direction, and then it suddenly goes here. So you see, we're kind of messing up the trajectory just a bit. So the same thing here. It goes here, slows down, and then you see it goes all the way here, and then here, and then here. So we get it a bit more chaotic. It's a bit too chaotic, maybe. This one is pretty nice. Again, this shape, we can emphasize the form. We're getting a bit too much of a straight line here, and we're working with a very smooth forms in most of the frames. So I would emphasize that smoothness and that roundness. So it's not bad to combine rounded shapes with straight lines and stuff, but if you're using only rounded shapes for the most of the animation, it's better to keep it in style and round things up to make them work. So the thing here is that it shrinks. It's way more bulky on the next frame, and it's way more bulky on the previous frame. So this transition will make the form seem a bit strange for a frame. So we can add a bit of mass, emphasize that smooth form. And essentially just work a bit on design. And the same thing here. Since we are working with smooth masses and we want to preserve the momentum. Right now you see it stops immediately, then goes again. So we are interrupting the motion a bit. And again, dividing right in the center makes the design a bit more predictable, and you can see that we get a very clear sense of symmetry. Everything is repeated. So in terms of motion, this is a very nice animation, works pretty well. Most of the edits that I propose are quite small, and they mostly relate to polishing it up, making the design more interesting, adding more variety there, and stuff like that. So it's just really paying attention to the finer aspect of the motion. See, it slows down, and then you suddenly accelerate it again. So all this small stuff will contribute to your animation feeling more like a finished product, more like a very polished final animation rather than a rough. So in this animation again, we can work a bit more on the shape here. We can just round it up since it was rounded before. Again, you see, it goes and it doesn't go, and then it goes. So what we can do here is draw this frame, draw the next frame, and connect it to the next frame, and it will work better, and we'll get a more clear sense of the form. Here, since this frame is more rounded, we can round the scene just a bit. And since we get a deceleration here, we can start decreasing the shape length, decrease it even more, and even more. Again here, just making the shape more appealing. Same thing here, making sure that the shape is clean, the edge is clean, that we are getting nice transition. Same thing here. Again, making sure that our edges are nice. And stuff like that. For this animation, I like the timing, I like the spacing. One thing that we can potentially do is look at the transition here and this shape and the tail. So let's look at the spacing. For the first part, so you see, we get a deceleration and then we suddenly get acceleration again. Acceleration, deceleration, deceleration, deceleration. So what we can do here is smooth it out a bit. Can add a small change here. But I guess this thing is the moment where we can change the spacing up a bit to make a more clear transition. As for the tail, let's see. So it goes like this, goes like that, goes like this, goes like that. And again, suddenly decelerates, accelerates, decelerates, accelerates, decelerates, decelerates, and then decelerates. So we get two decelerations. So we get deceleration, acceleration, deceleration, acceleration. So we can work a bit on that. Push the tail further here, maybe up to this position, then push it further on this frame, push it further on this frame, and slow it down towards the end. And aside from that, we can also either remove this bit or we can indicate it somewhat here, because right now you see it appears for 2 frames and then it disappears, so it kind of doesn't connect with anything on the previous frame and on the next frame. So we need some indication of where it went, either a particle, a hole here, or something just to connect the animation so it doesn't just appear and disappear out of nowhere. We could do that with more frames, but with current amount of frames we need some indication since it's just 2 frames. Right here again we can work a bit on the shapes. If we are going for a smooth rounded look, we can round it up a bit. If we're going for this kind of thing, we can use it on the leading edge and reserve more rounded shapes to the particles since they are slowing down. And again we can work a bit on symmetry and not dividing particles right in the middle. So right here you can see that all these particles are kind of the same size. And this happens here as well. So everything kind of falls into the same size. Aside from that, it's pretty nice animation. Next up, after that, what do we have? We have these animations. So I like these animations quite a lot. I like the concept. I like the overall motion. So let's talk a bit about the design of the motion and stuff like that. So for this one, we've got quite fast acceleration into the distance, so it decreases in size quite fast, and this small spark works, but it doesn't really complement the motion. So the motion is quite fast, and so we can go way bigger and make it more dramatic, and it will work quite well. Why does this work quite well, and why does the small spark doesn't work that well? Well, it's because we are decreasing a very large mass and we are decreasing its size quite fast. So we get fast motion, big mass. So because of that, we have a very good anticipation, and this anticipation will work well with a bigger spark because we're decreasing this mass this big quite fast, so we can easily get away with a spark or spark explosion or something like that, similar to this mass or even a bit bigger. So something small will work, but it won't complement the motion since it's quite fast, and something much bigger will work better here. For the next animation, for this animation, I like the concept and I like the motion. One thing that we can do here to improve it is that, you see, you're decreasing its size from this frame to this frame, then we have a slowdown and rotation, and then you just keep decreasing its size. So we have the same type of motion, but we have a slow kind of stop in the middle, and this stop is quite nice if we add a different kind of motion. So if we're interrupting the same kind of motion, especially in this case, it will be okay, but it doesn't add a lot of interesting stuff to the animation, doesn't enhance the animation. However, it will work very well if we use different types of motion. So we use this slowdown, we use this halt as a transition to a different type of motion. So for example, if we slow it down and use this thing, and then instead of going like this and just decreasing it in size, if we explode it into particles, it will actually work very well and will still be quite readable. So let's see. And do this. And instead of that, we'll explode it. Something super fast, just to sketch out the idea. So it's just a frame or two, but I can see that it will work as an idea because we have this anticipation. And if we combine different types of motion, it will look more interesting generally. So it's just a suggestion to make it more interesting. So it doesn't have to be explosion, it's just a general principle. So you're interrupting the same kind of motion and then continuing it, and it will be more repetitive since you're doing the same motion just with a stop. But if you're using the slowdown or using change of direction to get a different type of motion, you will have more variety and you will have more interesting animation in general. So for this animation, I like the timing, I like the idea. So as an idea for improving this kind of animation, you can use this holes not just to erase, but for example to rotate this form, so it can go and not just erase it, but this can also push the form. So for example, the form can start rotating overall. So essentially you're combining this rotation and this thing, so you can easily do that to add more interesting kind of motion to the animation. As for this animation, it's pretty nice overall, I would say. What's in is to make it more clear, it's probably better to erase some of this small stuff, like the very thin lines. They make it kind of noisy and it will read better if you don't have it, because you'll get a more clean silhouette. You can keep some small particles, it's just about not making animation too cluttered and preserving a clean reading design. Another thing is again keeping the variety. On this stage we're kind of getting quite a lot of similar size of particles, so it's always nice to have variety, so we can have a bigger shape, a general big shape, a general smaller shapes. Right now all the shapes are kind of very similar in terms of the size, so it would be nice to have more variety in that. So kind of having bigger shapes, medium shapes, small shapes. We have some very small shapes and we have some medium shapes, but I don't have any larger masses, and so it may get pretty repetitive easily. And the same thing for the particles that you break it into. Particles that you break it into are pretty small and kind of the same type of thing, so they're just circles. So you can break it into lines, you can break it into this small stuff and just triangles and stuff like that. In terms of motion it works pretty okay. So for this animation, it looks pretty nice. Again, for the motion we can track some of the stuff and see how it goes. Right now, God. So you see it goes 1, it goes 2, it goes 3, then gets on, it goes 4 and 5. So we are kind of interrupting the motion. So you see it goes essentially 1, 2, 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. So we get this kind of motion. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, you're breaking it right in the middle, and we get very similar particles over here and over here. And this thing is overall broken in the center. And at the end, all the particles here kind of fall into the same category. So what would be nice here is to have a delay. So for example, we can dissipate circles into particles first. So for example, these turn into particles first, and then we get the bubbles turning smaller. Or we can do the other way around. So right now they disappear at the same time, sort of. And that's why it's a bit more repetitive. And we can break up this repetition by having them break up into different times with different timing. The second thing is working on the design. So you can see that we get two general masses kind of very similar in terms of the size, and then we break it into, again, repetitive or repeating particles. So it's just working on design in general. Next up, this one. For this one, it works pretty nice. One thing again is emphasizing and working on the particles, and on these frames working on the oval shape. I like the silhouette here, but here I guess we can make the silhouette a bit more interesting. So let's see, can we design it better? Because essentially, when you're working with effects animation, if you work with the more advanced stuff, you should think about the design of your elements. How do they look from the outside? How does the silhouette look? Is it interesting? Does it look dynamic? Well, let's see. I guess we can emphasize this design here. So this bubbles doesn't emphasize direction, so it appears here. Again, bigger area, smaller area, bigger area, nothing here. So we can just remove the bubble and emphasize this sharp edge instead. Again, adding smaller bits for variety, that's good, always good. Then emphasizing this arch, connecting it. And we can do that, yeah, why not? Let's emphasize this arch and make a nice difference in terms of width. And then, if we added this bit here on the previous frame, we'll keep some connection, but kind of more thin on this frame. Okay. Now to emphasize this arch, but on the inside, we can do something like that. And to emphasize direction here, we can use a line with a slightly different angle here. And since we were having this on the previous frame, I'll keep it but smaller on this frame. Now, if you want to add particles to kind of amplify and add a bit of seasoning to this design, then we should think how these particles fit into the overall motion. So the overall motion was the curve, the arch going like this. So if we add these bits going in the opposite direction, they won't emphasize the animation. They will interfere a bit with the direction. So I'll add the bit, but it will be moving forward. Then I'll add a bit here, following this, emphasizing our rotation instead of breaking it up. And then we'll have pretty nice animation. And we can add some edge here to make it more interesting. So let's compare designs. So it was like this, and now it's like this. You see that we get a more clear indication of the direction, get a more clear indication of the form. That's why it's important to work on the design of your frames. So you can do the same thing here. So it was going inside. We want to emphasize the difference, so we don't want to repeat this stuff. We don't want it to be parallel. Add an overarching curve, the biggest curve here, so we're gonna emphasize that instead. We're emphasizing this curve and this curve, so it's going here, the particle is going in this direction, so let's emphasize the general direction. Since it's going like this on the next frame, let's emphasize the rotation in this direction. So it can go like this. Emphasizing the form here. Emphasizing that. Had a nice edge here, so we'll use that edge and move it further with the direction of the rotation. So we had sharp particles, so we'll round it up, but just a bit. We don't want to round it up all the way to keep this nice fast shape language. And since this particle and this mass is going forward on this frame, we'll keep it moving it forward to keep that momentum, so that it doesn't interrupt the motion. And we'll add a bit of particles here to emphasize the motion. Maybe some stuff. Breaking up away from the form. And if you want, we can follow this. Maybe add something inside to emphasize the rotation even more. So it's just about designing the shapes and paying attention to how it's going, how it's planned, what we can do to improve it. So next step, we'll close this, we'll close that, and we'll go to mass motion. So for this scene, the overall motion of the bubbles is okay. It's a bit sketchy, and we can work a bit on the transition between forms in some parts. So we'll talk about this first. And the second thing is this kind of bubbles and the way you're adding it won't work with fire. So it will work as animation for bubbles, and this blue animation will kind of work as animation for masses, but if you combine these two, they won't make fire, because for the fire animation to work, you gotta keep something else in mind as well. So first off, I guess we can start more simple and without adding so many shapes, but let's talk about these bubbles first, and then we'll talk about the fire and why you can't just add any kind of bubbles to make the fire animation. So let's start with bubbles. So we have bubble going here, going like this, going like that, going like this. You see again, the size increases, so it gets bigger, and then it instantly gets smaller. So this transition is quite fast. And for that to work, I would probably decrease the size of the bubble here. Then we get a fast acceleration and an instant deceleration. So again, for that to work, we would probably need to add a frame or two, or to change it up a bit. Because you see again, the issue is that we have this huge acceleration and instant deceleration. Then we slow down again, and we again increase in size instantly and accelerate. Then the size barely changes. We go, again increase in size, increase in size, increase in size. And then we go, and we accelerate. So we slow down, we accelerate it. So right here in this place, the form will wobble quite a lot, and it will work for a sketch animation, but for the clean animation the transition is a bit too rough. So you see, if we look at the edges, we'll get very fast deceleration, sudden acceleration, and then suddenly we move to a different spot and accelerate a lot, and then decelerate quite a lot, and then accelerate again. So this transition will be quite rough because we've got so many changes, and the changes happen so quickly. So again, we move with the same spacing kinda, slow down, suddenly accelerate, accelerate in the opposite direction, accelerate even more, slow down even more, and then we accelerate again. So for this to work, we would need a deceleration here, more build up here for the transition to work, and a slowdown at the end. Otherwise, it will be quite wobbly, since we have so many changes and so much stuff going on. Now let's talk about the blue animation. So for the blue animation, so what we need is to transfer masses from bottom to the top. So you see, we slow down quite a lot, and then we get a sudden acceleration again. Sudden slow down, sudden acceleration. So you see, we're kind of getting this. So sudden deceleration, acceleration, deceleration, deceleration, acceleration. Then again, we're decelerating suddenly and then accelerating. Going like this, suddenly decelerating, accelerating. And then you see we suddenly change the position. And it happens quite fast. So we would need to change this up a bit and get more gradual base motion for that to work a bit better. So again, we're going, slowing down, and then we accelerate quite a lot. We go like this, slow down, accelerate a bit, go here, and you see we went in this direction, and then we go in the opposite direction. then we go in this direction again, and we go in the opposite direction. Sudden acceleration, we go here, and suddenly we go in the opposite direction. So there are just many changes. We go like this a bit too many times. So we can build a gradual transition over the curve here and place our frames on this curve, and this way it will be way easier to plan, and you can easily place your forms, and this will be much easier to control. So let's talk about fire and why you can't just use any kind of bubbles to make fire animation. So for the fire animation to work, so what is this? So what are the holes? Holes indicate this, that we have a current of air, so we have an air current that goes through the fire, pushes the fuel, pushes the burning fuel, pushes the fire, and swirls it. That's why it won't usually happen at the source of the fire. So if we're adding holes, most of the time we don't want to add too many holes at the bottom, because otherwise the fire won't really burn like that. Because if the current is that strong at the bottom, the fire will be just burning in a different direction. It will be pushed by the air, smashed by the wind, and it will be burning like, if the current is that strong that it reaches the source of the fire and it's pushing it like this and rotating it, the fire will probably burn like this. So if we have this strong power here, the fire will probably burn to the side, and so on. So the holes don't usually appear, at least base level holes, which is the absence of fire. They don't usually appear right at the bottom. The second thing is that we don't want the holes to travel through fire, with fire disconnecting and then connecting. So if there is no mass here, there are rare cases where the mass can go back and connect it back, but it won't happen most of the time, because again, the air current is passing through fire, turbulence and stuff. It just can't go against that current and go back and connect instantly. So it's better to keep the overall shape. So then where do we add our holes and stuff? So on the base level, when you're trying to animate fire and it's a small fire, we're adding holes and stuff on the base layer, on the edges. So we don't want holes to travel right through the fire randomly in all places. We want to place these holes along the curve of the fire, essentially forming the outline, and then we can add a bit of holes somewhere here and stuff and emphasize that. But we don't want the holes to be there all the time, breaking up the silhouette so much. We want the holes to help us guide the edge of the fire rather than breaking it up into pieces. Because if the wind is so strong that it's breaking fire into pieces, the fire won't burn straight. It will break into small streaks of fire, and essentially we'll only have some fire at the top or at the bottom, and we will have streaks of fire and embers instead of having a solid block of fire. So if we're dealing with holes, we're trying to add them on the edges rather than trying to break up the entire fire. Second thing is we want to have variety of holes here, and we want to keep the design of the fire more or less interesting, and we want to really think about that. So we want the holes to be different in distance between them. So if the holes get too repetitive, we'll get this. And we don't really want that. This is not a very interesting design. We want to have a nice combination of masses and fire. So we actually we don't need that many holes if the fire isn't a huge one. So for the smaller fire, we need just a couple of holes really to make it look interesting, to guide it. So like here, have a long one, this one, and this one. And you see they're all different in size and in shape. And they all help us guide and create fire. So we don't really need that many of them, and we want to be very specific when we add it and how we add it. So that's the thing. And the same thing with bubbles. So again, we can polish up the motion a bit. So the overall motion of the bubble works. It's just that the transition between sizes and between some edges don't work that well, because we have a lot of changes in direction and a lot of changes in size. So for the most of your animations, this is the thing that I noticed, is that we really need to understand how to do that polish, because most of your animations have a very good base motion. You have a very good general understanding of the motion, but when you just need to push it a bit more and push it to the finish, because it's always a bit rough in terms of like finer details, like the form on some frames may not work, it may be smaller and then bigger, or the size may suddenly change, or the direction may suddenly change, and that's what gives it a nice polished look, having that consistency. And if you are able to add that, your animations will be quite professional. It's understanding that and managing to do it. So for the bubbles, for example, have this nice transition here. We get an increase in size. It's going pretty well. So we see it extending, double extends, goes like this, goes like that. Slow down, and then we get a sudden acceleration. Then we get a deceleration here, but the bubble accelerates in this direction. Goes here, goes like this, and then again we had deceleration, we get acceleration. And then you see it suddenly changes directions completely, and we get an acceleration in a different direction. And then we get acceleration in this direction. And then it accelerates in this direction, and this is the leading edge. And then we get it like this, and that's the thing. So that's what makes it a bit rough and unpolished. And then again, we had a slowdown, we have an acceleration. We have slowdown, slowdown, but it wobbles quite a lot to the side. So we go like this, go like that. You see sudden acceleration here and instant deceleration. So we see again, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, suddenly 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, suddenly 8, suddenly. So it goes here, but then it goes back, and then it goes down again. And here it goes straight, goes up per frame, and then instantly goes down and follows a line. So we get this kind of spacing. And this will inevitably influence the form and make it look a bit chaotic because we have so many transitions in so few frames, just a few frames, and so many changes. And so as for connecting it, I wouldn't really suggest connecting it because these bubbles are kind of just, they all have different directions, they all have, it's the same source, but have a different kind of motion. And if you connect it with a straight or more or less a straight line, it wouldn't really work to emphasize the motion. You can connect it as a stream of bubbles, but then you would have to keep in mind that they all have this kind of direction. So you can emphasize stream of bubbles with something like you have bubble stream, goes like this, bubbles break up from it, and they don't infinitely stay with it. So it can be something like that, but if you just connect it all in one form, it wouldn't really work that well. So on this frame, for example, just connecting it like that, it makes some sense, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, since they all have very different kind of motion. So for this to work, we can work with this, but we'd have to get creative, so the bubbles itself don't give us enough information about the motion. So we can combine these two if we really want, and do something like that. Put a particle or two here, and out that there is a source of bubbles here. These bubbles break up, or for example, we can break up these bubbles, make this one a bit smaller to make it more interesting. And here again, can use it, but we'd have to be more creative about it and think about the overall motion and how it can work. So let's look on the last animation. So here, pretty nice. One thing we can look at here is the in-betweens, so some in-betweens. The general direction here, right here, is like this, like that, and this is pretty nice. One thing that I notice is that the transition here, you see, the in-between between these lines and this line is a line here, so that's right. But the in-between between this line and this line is over here, so we gotta push it a bit back. Here, just refine this a bit will help. And you see, we've got an indication of a hole here, and then we have a hole here, so we can push the form like this a bit. As for this part, let's back. It's like this. So right here, this kind of works. On the other hand, this part You see, it goes 1, goes 2, it goes 3. So this form, it goes up to the right. And if you put the frame here, it will have to go down first and then it has to go up. So it would be better to start it a bit lower so that we continue this motion. Continue the motion. So something like this. And the second thing, the same thing with this part. So it shrinks, becomes smaller, and it goes in this direction. So if we put it like that, it would have to go back first and then go forward. So it would be better if we put it here so that it connects with the overall motion. So it goes here, goes in a curve, decreases in size. For the spacing here, let's see, have this frame, have that frame again, putting this in between right here instead of pushing it further, and the previous in between we see it gets from here to here, so we should put it over here, so slightly higher, and then it will work. And yeah, as for the lighting animation, again, it's all about clarity. It works pretty okay right now. It's just a bit too covered by these small bits. So we won't have a very good general sense of form, have to repeat in big shapes, but we don't get very nice continuous shape. So it would be nice to have very thought out general direction and general shape, and adding a bit of these smaller shapes, but not over abundance, because right now there are a lot of bigger shapes, a lot of smaller shapes, but we don't get a very good general bigger shape. So we need these smaller shapes to emphasize the motion and don't distract us from it too much. And right now there are just so many of them that it's very hard to keep track of the general motion. So we want to add clarity to the animations. And that's it for the breakdown, I guess. I hope it helps you. This is another way to plan for animations. So instead of using bubbles, you can use dots as well to mark off the edges, and you're just animating the dots first. Let's find the dots. So duplicate it and I show you the dots. So I'm just using dots with different timing and spacing, and then I am using them to mark off the edges of the fire. So that's another way to plan fire animations, or any other animation in general. So hope that helps you, and wish you good luck with your animations.